Picture this: flashing red and blue lights illuminating a quiet suburban street on a cold December evening. Not because of a crime, not because of an emergency, but because someone decorated their home for Christmas. The police stood there bewildered as an HOA president demanded they arrest a homeowner for the crime of spreading holiday cheer. What started as a simple string of lights turned into a legal battle that would expose years of corruption, abuse of power, and petty tyranny that had been festering in this seemingly perfect neighborhood. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness one of the most absurd, infuriating, and ultimately satisfying neighborhood battles you've ever heard. This isn't just about Christmas lights. This is about what happens when unchecked power meets someone who refuses to back down. And trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand why an entire community came together to take down the woman who thought she ruled their lives. The homeowner's name was Marcus Chen, and he had no idea that his modest holiday display would spark a war that would reshape his entire neighborhood forever. Marcus Chen never wanted to be a troublemaker. For 8 years, he had been the model resident of Pinewood Meadows, a planned community development on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. The neighborhood was one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions that promised affordable home ownership with amenities, maintenance-free living, and a sense of community. Spanish-style homes lined perfectly manicured streets. Every lawn was the same shade of green. Every mailbox was regulation black. Every house number was displayed in the approved brass font. Marcus was a software engineer who worked from home, a quiet man in his early 40s who kept to himself and rarely attended neighborhood events. He had purchased his 3-bedroom home as a bachelor, but over the years it had become his sanctuary. His parents had immigrated from Taiwan decades earlier, and Marcus had grown up watching them work tirelessly to give him opportunities. Now, with his mother battling cancer and his father caring for her full-time, Marcus found himself reflecting more on family, tradition, and what really mattered in life. But have you ever lived somewhere where every single decision about your own property had to be approved by someone else? Because that was life in Pinewood Meadows. A 5-member board governed the Homeowners Association, but everyone knew who really ran things: Patricia Holloway, the HOA president. Patricia was a woman in her late 50s with helmet-like blonde hair, designer athleisure wear that she wore to grocery shopping, and an expression that suggested she was perpetually smelling something unpleasant. She had been HOA president for 9 consecutive years, running unopposed after systematically intimidating anyone who dared challenge her authority. Patricia didn't just enforce the rules, she weaponized them. She had fined elderly residents for having their trash cans visible 15 minutes past the pickup deadline. She had threatened legal action against a young family whose toddlers' chalk drawings on their own driveway violated aesthetic standards. She had even attempted to ban a military veteran from flying an American flag, claiming it was too large and not in compliance with the flag display specifications outlined in subsection 7.3(2) of the community guidelines. The other board members were essentially her rubber stamps. There was Gerald, a retired accountant who nodded at everything Patricia said. Sandra, a real estate agent who feared Patricia would tank her property values if crossed. Mike, who barely attended meetings. And Karen, yes, actually named Karen, who was Patricia's best friend and co-conspirator in neighborhood surveillance. Now you might be wondering, why didn't residents vote them out? Great question. Patricia had mastered the art of HOA manipulation. Board elections were held at inconvenient times with minimal notice. Proxy votes were mysteriously lost. New residents weren't informed about their voting rights. And anyone who spoke against Patricia found themselves on the receiving end of harassment, frivolous fines, and property inspections that bordered on stalking. Marcus had witnessed this culture of fear, but had largely avoided it by staying compliant. His beige house was regulation. His drought-resistant landscaping was pre-approved. His car was always parked in the garage. He paid his dues on time and never made waves. Until December 2023. Marcus's mother had been given a difficult prognosis that fall. The cancer had spread, and doctors were talking about making her comfortable rather than pursuing aggressive treatment. During a particularly emotional visit, his mother mentioned how she missed the elaborate Christmas displays they had seen during her first years in America. She spoke wistfully about the joy those lights had brought her, how they represented hope and celebration in a new country where everything felt foreign and overwhelming. Something shifted in Marcus that day. He realized he had been living small, following arbitrary rules created by petty tyrants, never making memories or taking chances. His mother might not see another Christmas. He was going to give her something beautiful to remember. What would you do if you had to choose between following ridiculous rules and creating one last meaningful memory for someone you love? Marcus started planning his display in early November. He wasn't trying to win any contests or break any records. He wanted tasteful, classic, and meaningful. He researched the HOA guidelines thoroughly. The covenant mentioned holiday decorations in only one paragraph, which stated that holiday displays should be temporary, not permanently affixed to structures, and in keeping with the aesthetic character of the community. There were no specific restrictions on lights, no limitations on quantities, and no approval process mentioned. He purchased quality LED lights that were energy efficient and safe. He planned a display of warm white lights outlining his roofline, icicle lights hanging from the eaves, and a beautiful lighted tree in his front yard. He added a nativity scene, some candy cane pathway lights, and a few tasteful animated figures. It was a Christmas card. Perfect, not tacky or excessive. The day after Thanksgiving, Marcus spent an entire weekend installing his display. Neighbors walking by stopped to compliment him. Children pointed and smiled. An elderly couple who lived 3 houses down told him it was the most beautiful thing they'd seen in the neighborhood in years. For 3 blissful days, Marcus felt like he had done something right. Then Patricia noticed. The letter arrived via certified mail on a Tuesday morning, 5 days after Marcus had turned on his Christmas lights. The return address was the Pinewood Meadows HOA, and the envelope had an official, threatening weight to it. Marcus signed for it with a sense of dread he couldn't quite explain. Inside was a formal violation notice, printed on official letterhead with the HOA seal embossed at the top. The language was aggressive and clinical, the kind of legal jargon designed to intimidate rather than communicate. Notice of covenant violation. Immediate action required. The notice stated that Marcus violated Section 4.7 of the Community Covenants regarding exterior modifications and decorations. His Christmas display had not been submitted for Architectural Review Committee approval. Furthermore, his display violated the aesthetic standards of the community by being excessive, commercially scaled, and visually inappropriate for a residential setting. He was given 72 hours to remove the display entirely or face fines of $100 per day with the potential for legal action and a lien being placed on his property. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his confusion turning to anger. There was nothing in the actual covenant language about requiring approval for temporary holiday decorations. His display wasn't excessive by any reasonable standard. And commercially scaled? He had seen actual commercial displays. His few hundred lights were modest at best. He called the HOA Management Company, a third-party firm that handled the administrative work for Patricia's board. The woman who answered was apologetic, but unhelpful. She explained that the board had recently clarified its position on holiday decorations and that all exterior displays required pre-approval. When Marcus asked when this clarification had occurred, she hesitated before admitting it had been discussed in a board meeting just 3 days earlier. Does it seem suspicious to you that they created a new rule the moment someone did something the HOA president didn't like? Because it certainly seemed that way to Marcus. He decided to attend the next board meeting, which was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, he did not remove his lights. He had committed to giving his mother this gift, and he wasn't going to let Patricia Holloway's power trip take that away. The fines began accumulating immediately, $100 per day. By the time the board meeting arrived, Marcus was theoretically $700 in debt to an organization that couldn't actually cite a valid rule he had broken. The board meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a bland room with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting that hummed annoyingly throughout the proceedings. About 20 residents were in attendance, which was unusual. Most meetings attracted only the board members, and perhaps one or two homeowners with specific grievances. Marcus noticed people looking at him with a mixture of sympathy and fear. A few gave him encouraging nods. Others avoided eye contact entirely, as if his rebellion might be contagious. Patricia called the meeting to order with the self-importance of someone addressing the United Nations. She worked through the agenda with mechanical efficiency. Budget reports, landscaping contract renewals, and pool maintenance schedules. She saved Marcus's violation for last, introducing it with barely concealed glee. Have you ever watched someone enjoy wielding power over others? It's a disturbing thing to witness. Patricia described Marcus's display as an egregious violation of community standards. She claimed multiple residents had complained, though she refused to name them or provide any evidence of these complaints. She presented photos of his house that had obviously been taken from his own front yard, which meant someone had trespassed on his property to document his supposed offense. When Marcus was finally allowed to speak, he calmly presented his case. He had reviewed the covenants thoroughly. Nowhere did they explicitly require approval for temporary holiday decorations. His display was tasteful, safe, and temporary. He had not modified any structures. He had not violated any written rule. Patricia's face flushed red. She was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not with facts and logic. She responded by claiming that the board had the authority to interpret covenants, and that their interpretation was final. She referenced the recent board meeting where they had clarified the holiday decoration policy. Marcus pointed out that this clarification had occurred after he had installed his display and that retroactively applying new rules violated basic principles of fairness. Several residents nodded in agreement, which enraged Patricia further. Then Patricia made her first critical mistake. She claimed that Marcus's display was culturally inappropriate and not in keeping with the traditional American Christmas aesthetic. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Marcus, a Taiwanese-American man, was being told his Christmas display wasn't American enough. The room went silent. Even Patricia's usual supporters looked uncomfortable. Karen tried to interject with something about maintaining property values, but the damage was done. Marcus responded with quiet dignity. He pointed out that people of all backgrounds celebrated Christmas, and that his display featured entirely traditional elements. He suggested that Patricia's real issue wasn't with the lights themselves, but with the person who had installed them. The meeting ended badly. Patricia tabled further discussion and announced that the fines would continue, and the board would be consulting with their attorney about enforcement options. Marcus left feeling both defiant and exhausted. But here's where things get interesting. Marcus wasn't the only person Patricia had pushed too far. Over the next few days, Marcus started receiving messages from other residents. A young couple who had been fined for planting unapproved flowers. A single mother who had been harassed for parking her work van on the street. A retired teacher who had been cited for having a garden gnome visible from the street. An elderly veteran who was still fighting Patricia's flag restrictions. They shared stories of abuse, intimidation, and financial harassment. One family had spent over $3,000 in fines and legal fees, fighting baseless violations. Another had been forced to remove a vegetable garden their children had planted for a school project. Several people had considered selling their homes to escape Patricia's tyranny. The Christmas lights had become a symbol. Marcus hadn't intended to be a revolutionary, but his simple act of resistance had given others courage to speak up. Meanwhile, Patricia escalated. She sent another certified letter informing Marcus that if he didn't remove the display within 48 hours, the HOA would enter his property and remove it themselves with all costs being added to his fine balance. She also filed a complaint with the City Code Enforcement Office, claiming his electrical display was a safety hazard. The city inspector who arrived was a middle-aged man named Tom, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He spent 15 minutes examining Marcus's display, testing connections, and checking for code violations. Finally, he turned to Marcus and said the installation was not only safe, but actually better than most professional installations he'd seen. He refused to issue any citations and noted in his report that the complaint appeared to be frivolous and motivated by a personal dispute. That would be the end of it, right? A city official confirming there was no safety issue? But Patricia was just getting started. She began conducting daily property inspections of Marcus's home, looking for any possible violation she could cite. She found a small crack in his driveway that she claimed needed immediate repair. She measured his grass height daily, hoping to catch him a quarter-inch over the maximum allowed length. She sent multiple letters about the positioning of his trash cans, the type of doormat he used, and even the brand of his garden hose, which she claimed was the wrong shade of green. The harassment was relentless and obviously coordinated. Karen, Patricia's co-conspirator, would drive by Marcus's house multiple times per day, taking photos and notes. Other residents reported seeing Patricia herself sitting in her car outside Marcus's house in the evenings, watching. Marcus's daily fines for the Christmas lights had now exceeded $2,000. Patricia sent a letter informing him that if the balance weren't paid within 30 days, the HOA would initiate foreclosure proceedings. She could actually force the sale of his home over Christmas lights. But Patricia had made a critical miscalculation. She had assumed Marcus was isolated. She didn't realize that her years of abuse had created a large group of residents who were waiting for someone to stand up to her. And she certainly didn't anticipate that Marcus had kept meticulous records of every interaction, every letter, every violation notice, and every inconsistency in how rules were applied. What Patricia didn't know was that Marcus had already contacted an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. And what she really didn't know was that several other residents had done the same thing. The turning point came on December 15th, exactly 3 weeks after Marcus had first turned on his lights. It was a Friday evening, and Marcus had just returned from visiting his mother at the hospital. He was emotionally drained and physically exhausted. He pulled into his driveway, grateful to be home, planning to make some tea and try to relax. That's when Patricia struck. Marcus had barely stepped out of his car when he heard shouting. Patricia was standing in his front yard, not on the sidewalk where she might have had some legal right to be, but actually on his property, 10 feet from his front door. Karen was with her, holding a clipboard and what appeared to be a camera. Behind them, parked at an angle that blocked his driveway, was Patricia's white Mercedes SUV with its door still open, engine running. Patricia was screaming into her phone, her face contorted with rage. Marcus caught fragments of her words. Dangerous, illegal, public safety hazard, needs to be shut down immediately. She was talking to someone with authority, making demands, threatening consequences. When she saw Marcus, she lowered her phone slightly but didn't stop talking. She pointed at him dramatically, while telling whoever was on the other end that the violator had just arrived and that they needed to come immediately. Marcus felt something shift inside him. He was tired of being polite. He was tired of being reasonable. He was tired of allowing this woman to terrorize him and his neighbors. Have you ever reached that moment where you decide you're not going to take it anymore? Where something inside you says enough? Marcus pulled out his own phone and started recording. Patricia's eyes widened slightly when she saw the camera pointed at her, but she didn't stop. If anything, she became more theatrical, apparently believing her performance would be vindicated by whatever authority figure she had summoned. Within 10 minutes, a police cruiser pulled up. A young officer stepped out looking confused about why he'd been called to a well-lit suburban street with no apparent emergency. Patricia immediately rushed toward him, talking rapidly, gesturing wildly at Marcus's house. waving papers that turned out to be the HOA violation notices. She claimed Marcus was running an illegal commercial operation. She said his electrical display was dangerous and that she had received complaints about traffic hazards from people stopping to look at the lights. She insisted the officer needed to force Marcus to turn off the display immediately and cite him for various code violations. The officer, whose name tag read Officer Rodriguez, listened patiently while Patricia exhausted herself. Then he asked Marcus for his side of the story. Marcus was calm and factual. He explained that he was a homeowner displaying Christmas lights on his own property. He mentioned that a city code inspector had already examined the display and found it completely safe and legal. He noted that Patricia was the HOA president and that this was part of an ongoing dispute where the HOA was attempting to enforce rules that didn't actually exist in the written covenants. Officer Rodriguez walked around the display, examined the connections, and even chatted with a few neighbors who had come out to see what the commotion was about. Every single neighbor spoke in support of Marcus. One woman mentioned that Patricia had been harassing residents for years. An elderly man said he'd been waiting for someone to stand up to her. Finally. Here's something important about police officers. They're trained to recognize obsessive behavior and harassment patterns. And Officer Rodriguez was very good at his job. He returned to where Patricia and Marcus were waiting and delivered his assessment. There were no code violations. The display was on private property. No laws were being broken. He recommended that Patricia leave Marcus's property immediately as she was trespassing and that she stop calling 911 for civil HOA disputes, as it was a misuse of emergency services. Patricia's face went through several shades of red before settling on a deep purple. She sputtered something about the officer not understanding his authority, about the HOA having legal power, about Marcus being a troublemaker who was destroying property values. Then Officer Rodriguez said something that would prove to be very important later. He informed Patricia that if she called 911 again for a non-emergency HOA dispute, she could be cited for making false reports. He also noted that her repeated presence on Marcus's property, despite being asked to leave, could constitute harassment and stalking under Arizona law. Patricia got in her Mercedes and peeled out, leaving rubber marks on the street. Karen scurried after her. Officer Rodriguez gave Marcus his card and told him to call if the harassment continued. He also mentioned, almost casually, that Marcus might want to document everything because it seemed like a pattern of behavior that could be relevant in a legal context. Do you think that was the end? Because Patricia wasn't done, not even close. The next morning, Marcus woke up to find a letter duct taped to his front door. Not mailed, not left in his mailbox, but physically attached to his door with heavy-duty tape that left residue on his paint. The letter, on HOA letterhead, informed him that an emergency board meeting had been held at 6 a.m. that morning, and he had been declared in violation of 7 additional covenant sections. But Patricia had finally made the mistake Marcus's attorney had been waiting for. By holding an emergency board meeting with no notice to homeowners and no opportunity for Marcus to attend or present a defense, she had violated Arizona's HOA statutes, which required proper notice and due process. By entering his property to tape the letter to his door without permission, she had committed trespass and potentially vandalism by damaging his paint. And by claiming an emergency meeting had occurred at 6 a.m. on a Saturday, she had created a record that would be easy to challenge, since several board members later claimed they hadn't even known about the meeting. Marcus immediately forwarded everything to his attorney, a sharp woman named Jennifer Shaw, who had built her practice on taking down abusive HOAs. Jennifer had been collecting evidence for weeks, and this latest stunt gave her everything she needed. She filed an emergency motion in court that same day, arguing that the HOA was engaging in harassment, that they were violating their own governing documents and state law, and that they were attempting to enforce rules that didn't exist. She requested a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from assessing further fines or taking any action against Marcus until a hearing could be held. The hearing was scheduled for December 20th, just 5 days before Christmas. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Because while Jennifer was preparing for court, something was happening in Pinewood Meadows that no one had anticipated. Residents started putting up Christmas lights. Lots of Christmas lights. Within 3 days, over 40 homes in the subdivision had installed displays ranging from modest to spectacular. Some were clearly in solidarity with Marcus. Others were testing whether Patricia would try to find them all. A few were definitely making a statement, with displays that were far more elaborate than Marcus's. Patricia responded by sending violation notices to every single house with lights. She was now attempting to fine dozens of families simultaneously, accumulating tens of thousands of dollars in alleged HOA debt across the community. This was exactly what Jennifer had hoped would happen. It demonstrated a pattern of selective enforcement, abuse of power, and the arbitrary creation of rules. When residents started forwarding their violation notices to Jennifer, she added them as evidence to her court filing. The story also hit the local news. A reporter from the Phoenix affiliate of a national network ran a piece titled, "HOA Grinch Tries to Steal Christmas." The segment featured interviews with Marcus, several other residents, and a shot of the neighborhood at night with dozens of houses lit up in defiant celebration. They reached out to Patricia for comment, but she declined to appear on camera, instead sending a statement that accused Marcus of organizing a harassment campaign against the HOA board. The segment went viral. Within 24 hours, it had been picked up by national news outlets, shared across social media platforms, and spawned hundreds of think pieces about HOA tyranny. The overwhelming public sentiment was against Patricia, with many commenters sharing their own HOA horror stories. Have you ever seen someone's petty obsession turn into national humiliation? Because that's exactly what was happening to Patricia. But she still wouldn't back down. In fact, she doubled down. She hired an expensive attorney and filed a counter-motion arguing that Marcus was engaged in a coordinated campaign to undermine the HOA's legitimate authority. She claimed the media attention was defamatory and that Marcus had orchestrated the whole thing as a publicity stunt. She even submitted social media posts as evidence, trying to paint Marcus as an anti-HOA activist rather than a simple homeowner who wanted to display Christmas lights. The court hearing on December 20th was packed. The small courtroom was filled with Pinewood Meadows residents, local media, and even some people from other neighborhoods who had their own HOA grievances and saw this case as a proxy for their own fights. Judge Barbara Thornton presided, a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s who had a reputation for cutting through legal nonsense and focusing on facts. She reviewed the motions, examined the evidence, and asked pointed questions that made it clear she had done her homework. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that HOAs had broad authority to enforce aesthetic standards and that homeowners had agreed to those rules when they purchased their properties. He claimed that allowing Marcus to violate the rules would create chaos and undermine property values. But then Jennifer stood up, and she was brilliant. She walked the judge through the actual covenant language, highlighting that there was no specific prohibition on holiday lights and no approval process outlined for temporary decorations. She presented the evidence of selective enforcement, showing photos of other covenant violations throughout the neighborhood that Patricia had ignored, including several at homes belonging to board members. She played portions of the body camera footage from Officer Rodriguez's visit, showing Patricia's erratic behavior and the officer's assessment that no laws were being broken. Then, Jennifer dropped the bombshell. She presented evidence that Patricia had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including charging personal meals and shopping trips to the HOA credit card. She showed that Patricia had hired her nephew's landscaping company for community maintenance at prices significantly above market rate without soliciting competitive bids as required by the bylaws. She demonstrated that several fines assessed against residents had never been properly documented in board meetings and that the money collected had discrepancies when compared to actual HOA bank statements. Patricia's attorney tried to object, arguing that financial matters weren't relevant to the immediate dispute about Christmas lights. But Judge Thornton overruled him, noting that the pattern of behavior and potential financial misconduct went directly to the question of whether the HOA was acting in good faith. The judge took a brief recess and returned with her ruling. She granted Marcus's temporary restraining order, blocking the HOA from assessing any further fines related to holiday decorations and nullifying all existing fines stemming from his Christmas display. She also ordered an independent audit of HOA finances. She appointed a receiver to oversee HOA operations until a full board election could be held with proper notice to all homeowners. And then Judge Thornton said something that everyone in that courtroom would remember. She noted that HOAs were supposed to serve homeowners, not subjugate them. She stated that the behavior documented in this case represented an abuse of power that undermined the legitimate purpose of homeowners associations. She warned that if the financial audit revealed what she suspected, there could be criminal referrals for fraud and embezzlement. Patricia walked out of the courtroom pale and shaking. Karen was crying. Their attorney looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Marcus walked out vindicated but exhausted. He just wanted to go home, see his mother, and enjoy Christmas. The independent audit took 6 weeks and revealed even more than anyone had suspected. The audit also revealed that fines assessed against residents had been wildly inconsistent and often improperly documented. Many residents had paid fines for violations that were never actually approved by board votes. The HOA's legal expenses had been astronomical, primarily because Patricia had used the association's attorney for personal matters and disputes that had nothing to do with legitimate community management. Can you imagine discovering that your HOA dues had been funding someone's personal shopping sprees for years? Because that's exactly what Pinewood Meadows residents learned. The fallout was swift and comprehensive. Patricia was removed from the board immediately. The association filed a lawsuit against her for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and embezzlement. Her case was also referred to law enforcement, and she was eventually charged with multiple felonies. Karen quietly resigned from the board and put her house up for sale, unable to face the neighbors she had helped terrorize. The Attorney General's office got involved because the pattern of abuse in Pinewood Meadows wasn't unique. They launched a broader investigation into HOA governance across Arizona, which eventually led to legislative reforms strengthening homeowner rights and increasing oversight of association finances. But the most immediate change was in Pinewood Meadows itself. A special election was held in February 2024, with the highest voter turnout in the community's history. Marcus didn't want to be on the board. Still, he helped organize a slate of reasonable candidates who believed in minimal governance, transparent finances, and treating homeowners like adults rather than subjects. The new board's first action was to revise the covenants, removing vague language that had been used to justify arbitrary enforcement. They established clear, specific rules where rules were actually necessary and eliminated petty restrictions that served no legitimate purpose. Holiday decorations were explicitly protected. Garden gnomes were legal. American flags could be displayed at any reasonable size. The Architectural Review Committee was reformed to focus on genuinely important structural and safety issues rather than paint colors and doormat styles. They also established a process for residents to appeal decisions and request a variance from rules when circumstances warranted flexibility. The culture of fear was replaced with a culture of community. Marcus's Christmas lights stayed up through early January, just as his mother had asked. She passed away peacefully on January 8, 2024, having seen one last beautiful Christmas. At her funeral, Marcus was surprised by how many neighbors attended. People he barely knew came to pay their respects and tell him how much his stand had meant to them. The young couple who had been fined for flowers brought a beautiful arrangement. The single mother with the work van helped organize the reception. The veteran who had fought the flag restrictions presented Marcus with a folded American flag and thanked him for defending freedom, even in a small way. The story didn't end neatly. Patricia fought the criminal charges, the civil lawsuit dragged on, and recovering the embezzled funds proved difficult. But she eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to make restitution. She also lost her house in the civil judgment. Some residents felt satisfaction at her downfall. Others felt it was sad to see someone so consumed by the need for control that she destroyed her own life. Marcus tried not to think about Patricia at all. He had never wanted to ruin anyone's life. He had just wanted to put up Christmas lights for his dying mother. The broader impact extended far beyond one neighborhood. The case became a rallying point for HOA reform advocates across the country. It was cited in legislative hearings in multiple states. It inspired other homeowners to challenge abusive associations. It even led to the creation of nonprofit organizations dedicated to helping residents navigate HOA disputes and advocate for their rights. But here's the most important part of this story: the small ways the community changed. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before became friends. Block parties were organized not by the HOA, but by residents who wanted to connect. A community garden was established in a common area, with vegetables donated to local food banks. Children played in the streets again without fear of their families being fined for minor infractions. Marcus continued to live in Pinewood Meadows. He eventually sold his house not because he was driven out, but because he wanted something smaller and with less maintenance. His mother's death had given him perspective on what mattered, and he wanted to spend less time maintaining a house and more time living his life. Before he moved, the new HOA board installed a small plaque in the community park. It didn't mention Patricia or the fight or the ugliness. It simply said, "Community means caring for each other, not controlling each other." The Christmas following his mother's death, Marcus returned to visit friends in Pinewood Meadows. The neighborhood was lit up spectacularly, with dozens of displays ranging from classic to creative. Families walked the streets admiring the lights. Children were bundled up, drinking hot chocolate, and pointing at their favorite displays. It was everything his mother would have loved. One of the new board members, a woman named Rosa who had been fined under Patricia's regime for planting sunflowers, organized an informal gathering at the clubhouse. Hot cider, cookies, and a chance for neighbors to actually enjoy each other's company. She asked Marcus to say a few words, but he declined. He wasn't a public speaker, and this night wasn't about him. But as he walked through the neighborhood later that evening, looking at the lights reflecting off windows and illuminating happy faces, he thought about what his mother had taught him. She had always said that small acts of courage create ripples you can't predict. Standing up for what's right, even in small ways, even when it's difficult, even when the stakes seem trivial to others, matters more than you think. Because this story was never really about Christmas lights. It was about dignity. It was about refusing to be bullied. It was about recognizing that unchecked power, even in the smallest of kingdoms like a homeowners association, will always corrupt. It was about the difference between rules that serve a community and rules that serve the ego of someone who craves control. It was about ordinary people finding the courage to say no to petty tyrants. About neighbors standing together when standing alone would have been easier. About the sometimes painful but ultimately necessary process of holding leaders accountable when they abuse their authority. Patricia Holloway started as just another power-hungry HOA president in one subdivision in Phoenix, Arizona. But her downfall, sparked by one man's simple desire to honor his dying mother with Christmas lights, became a symbol for everyone who has ever felt powerless against arbitrary authority. The legal precedents set by Marcus's case have been cited in dozens of subsequent HOA disputes. Several states passed legislation directly inspired by the abuses uncovered in Pinewood Meadows. Insurance companies began requiring more oversight of HOA finances. Management companies implemented better checks and balances to prevent individual board members from wielding unchecked power. But more important than the legal and institutional changes were the individual transformations. Residents who had lived in fear learned they had more power than they realized. People who had accepted abuse as the price of home ownership discovered they didn't have to tolerate it. Communities across the country had conversations about governance, accountability, and what kind of neighborhoods they wanted to live in. And every Christmas, in subdivisions and developments across America, people put up lights and remember that sometimes the most important battles are fought not over grand principles, but over simple human joys, like decorating your home for the holidays, like honoring someone you love, like refusing to let petty bureaucrats steal the light from your life. Marcus Chen never sought fame or recognition. He just wanted to give his mother one last beautiful Christmas. The fact that his simple act of defiance exposed systemic corruption, led to legal reforms, and inspired countless others to stand up for themselves, that was never his goal, but it became his legacy. So the next time you see Christmas lights on a house or a garden gnome in a yard or a flag flying proudly or any other small expression of individuality and joy in a neighborhood that tries to force conformity, remember, someone fought for the right to display that. Someone refused to be told they couldn't express themselves on their own property. Someone said no to a bully and yes to freedom. And sometimes that makes all the difference. What small act of courage are you willing to take when faced with unjust authority? Where are you watching from? And what would you have done in Marcus's situation? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this remind us that ordinary people can change the world, one Christmas light at a time.